Thank you very much for that generous introduction, and thank you very much for the opportunity to be here. And let me congratulate this book club on its existence. You know, my Harvard colleague, Bob Putnam, has written about the phenomenon of social capital and has written about cities and communities where there are more things that bring people together in common purpose. Are cities and communities where kids grow up healthier, more likely to complete school, where the economy is more likely to prosper, and where the streets are more likely to be safe. So this is about having fun, but this kind of organization that brings people together is actually about something that's very important, and the weight of social science does suggest that where there's more of this kind of thing, there are many, many other good things that are happening. So I salute all the sponsors. I salute Leah Costello on her leadership, and I'm flattered by the invitation to join the prestigious list of speakers that you have had. And I am glad that I was introduced without an economist joke. Wasn't so long ago that I was introduced by the guy who said, "Larry, do you know what it takes to succeed as an economist?" And I said, "No." And he said, "An economist is someone who's pretty good with figures but doesn't quite have the personality to be an accountant." That was in Moscow, and no one got the joke. And then the guy sort of continues by saying, "Do you know about Einstein's trip to heaven?" And I said, "No, actually, I don't know about Einstein's trip to heaven." And he said, "Well, Einstein wanted to do better with people in heaven than he had on earth. He'd done well on earth, but he hadn't connected with people as well as he'd liked. So he was really going to make a special effort in heaven. And he met a first guy, and he said, so we can talk. What's your IQ? And the guy said 180. And Einstein said, that is fantastic. I have a new synthesis of quantum and cosmological theory, and I'd like to share it with you. And he met a second guy. What's your IQ? 140. And so I said, I have been thinking about the nature of international relations, political interactions between countries, and I think we could have a really good discussion. And he met a third guy. What's your IQ? 80. Einstein didn't know what to say. And then it came to him. What's your GDP forecast for the fourth quarter? Well, I'm going to try to follow Harold Wilson, the ex-Prime Minister of England's admonition to economists in public life. Name a number or name a date, but never name both. And I might even try to do one better and not name either. But what I want to talk to you about is where the American economy has been, where I think it's going, and in particular, what the crucial things that our political process is going to have to decide in the weeks, the months, and the years ahead. About a year ago, sometime around the turn of the year, I was back in Washington, having left the NEC at the end of 2010. And I had lunch with the president. and it was just the two of us in the little dining room off the Oval Office. We talked about one thing or another, and he said, "You know, Larry, what happens in the economy is going to be as important as anything else for whether I win or not." He said, "I think they're going to nominate Romney. I think I'm a better candidate than Romney. And I think our side's values," or this is the president talking, "our side's values are more in touch with the American people's than Romney. And I think we are set up to run an incredibly good campaign in terms of get out the vote, fundraising, all that kind of thing. But if the unemployment rate is 8.5% and people think that the economy is dead in the water, none of that may matter. What do you think is going to happen?" And I said to him, "Look, Mr. President, nobody can forecast these things. I don't know. I think the right guess is that we have successfully stopped and reversed the downturn, that the economy is climbing, but that you're walking through the Grand Canyon and you've just come off the floor and you're starting to climb up the other wall, but you are still well below sea level, and you're going to be well below sea level on election day, but you are going to be climbing." And then we talked about it for a few minutes, and his sense as a political leader actually tracked very well what the academic literature on economic determinants of elections says, which is that it's more the rate of change of the economy that is important than the level of the economy in predicting what's going to happen. So he said, you know, if we really get the 2.5% growth, then we'll have unemployment below 8.5%, and then it'll probably be okay, but it's going to be not an entirely clear thing. In retrospect, that conversation was pretty prescient. The unemployment rate was 7.9% on election day. The president won by about 2.5 percentage points. And if about 500,000 votes in 3 states had moved, he would have lost. And so he won by a clear but close margin with 7.9% unemployment. And that was because, and I stress this because I think it's relevant to the decision making going forward. That was because he had made an important decision in the first meeting where he met with his economic team in December of 2008. It's an important message for anybody who has a leadership position, that often the decisions you make at the very, very beginning set the tone for everything else that happens. At that first meeting, he said, we only get one chance to make a first impression. And let's make our mistakes be that we pull the Band-Aid off too fast, rather than that we try to pull the Band-Aid too slowly. Let's use that window. And that was his guidance. At the time, the debate, if you read the New York Times or Wall Street Journal, was about whether there should be $300 billion or $400 billion of stimulus. He decided to ask for close to $800 billion of stimulus. At the time, there was huge debate about whether it was possible to rescue the automobile companies or whether that would be industrial policy. He decided that if there was a realistic prospect of success, they had to be put through bankruptcy because otherwise they'd never make painful enough adjustments. But that you couldn't count on the capital markets in the midst of the worst financial crisis in 50 years to do the DIP financing, to do the necessary financing. So a decision was made about that. He decided that we had to lay bare what was going on in the banks, that the same loan sitting there being valued at 70 cents at Wells Fargo and 35 cents at Citigroup, or vice versa, just wasn't okay. That you had to have some picture that investors could see of what was in the banks, and you had to have an insistence that they get the capital from the private sector if they could, and from the public sector if they must. He put that in motion. It was all there. It was passed, it was legislated, it was happening by May 1st of 2009. And the economy, which had been losing 700,000 jobs a month, stopped losing 700,000 jobs a month, and it started to climb. Now, unfortunately, because of a combination of the political pressures and, frankly, some of what was being said in the markets and what some economists said, there was probably a tendency, as you got into 2010, to declare victory a little early and say, now we need to focus on long-run problems, when the reality was you still had a long walk through that canyon to go, and we still have a long walk to go through that canyon. So what are the political and economic challenges that face the president, and what's likely to happen? First, there's the really urgent, though I would argue less profoundly important. We could produce a man-made disaster of epic economic proportions. In order to get out of all the debt negotiations in August of 2011, Congress did something that was analogous to the theory of automobile safety that holds that if you put daggers in steering wheels, people will drive more carefully, and therefore you'll have fewer accidents. It's a kind of theory. It's not a very good theory, but it is a theory. And Congress basically legislated that if nobody did anything about the deficit and nobody did anything else, we would have massive tax increases at the beginning of January in 2013. We would hit the national debt limit, and the government would be unable to borrow, even to pay interest. We would cut the defense budget by about 7%, by cutting every single account in it by 7%. And we would make tax changes that would put another 20 million people on the alternative minimum tax. And if all of that happens, which is what will happen if nothing happens, we will have a recession. It is unlikely to be a mild recession. There is a chance we will be downgraded.
Our national security at a time when we've still got substantial troops in Afghanistan will be impaired. And it will all have been a 100% self-inflicted wound. It's exactly the daggers in the steering wheels thing. The daggers in the steering wheels is sort of a powerful incentive. But if you do the daggers in the steering wheel, things better not go wrong and have an accident, or it will get a lot worse. Now the problem is that it's like a game of chicken. It will be much worse. It'll be terrible for the country. It'll be terrible for the president. He's the president. He's supposed to produce good outcomes for the country. It will be terrible, terrible for the Republicans, who will have a much more difficult time explaining themselves than the president does. And so the first question, prior to any other, is navigate your way past this. The president is taking the position that he took throughout the campaign, that the portion of the tax cuts that had come from President Bush that were targeted to people with incomes over $250,000 a year need to be repealed. The Republicans, having before this said no taxes could go up any which way, are now saying, well, we could raise taxes, and maybe we could even raise taxes on rich people, but it's better to raise them by closing deductions and credits than by raising rates. What's going to happen? My prediction is that the newspapers on Friday, December 21st, will report that there's going to be a deal. Why do I make that prediction? Because deals never get done too early, so there won't be a deal before a kind of deadline, and because Congress wants to go home for Christmas. And if there isn't a deal, the world will be totally enraged with them if they're all not working and meeting and trying to compromise all through the holidays. And their spouses will kill them if they're not home for Christmas. So my prediction, I mean, it's not elevated, it's not lofty, but my prediction is that the weekend before the holiday, they will reach a deal. And what the deal will do is it will somehow raise taxes, mostly by raising rates on high-income people. And then they won't sequester spending, they won't sequester the defense budget, they won't do the other credit, they'll extend the tax cuts for middle-income people, and disaster will be averted. That's the fiscal cliff. Is this a good thing? It's a much better thing than the alternative. Will this spur the economy forward? Maybe a bit, because some people are worried that it won't happen. But mostly it will avoid sending the economy, it's like my stepdaughter's learning to drive, and she says, I stayed in my lane all the way today. Well, that's good, but it's not usually thought of as a vast achievement. That's kind of the way to think about this fiscal cliff. So that's the first issue. Second issue, there are going to be sort of four clusters here. The second issue is, are we going to make the economy grow faster? Right now, the consensus forecast, which basically assumes that we won't have a fiscal cliff problem, a huge fiscal cliff problem, basically assumes that Europe won't implode, basically assumes that oil won't spike, basically assumes that China won't be dramatic. under those assumptions, the forecast is for 2.5% growth. It's better than less, but it's not really enough. So the right thing to do, and it's less clear whether this will happen, and if it does happen, how quickly it will happen, is to do things to raise the level of demand in the country. Because if you think about it, the reason why we have 8% unemployment, the reason why the economy is growing slowly, is not because it doesn't have the potential to produce substantially more than a GDP level 2% above where we were 6 years ago in 2007. It's because the demand isn't there for businesses. Are there kinds of demand to stimulate that would be good? How many of you have been to Kennedy Airport? Is there anyone who's been to Kennedy Airport who thinks that the United States should be proud to have Kennedy Airport as the gateway to its leading city? Going once, going twice. I say to you that if a moment when the interest rate for 10 years is 1.5%, a moment when the construction unemployment rate approaches 15%, is not the time to fix Kennedy Airport and a lot of other things. When will that time ever come? Is this the right time, I ask you, to be repealing our payroll tax cuts that put money in middle-income families' households, in middle-income families' wallets, that took at least a little bit off the cost for employers of hiring middle-income workers at a time when so many businesses are on the margin? There are plenty of things to do. Is this the time for a regulatory blitz to achieve social objectives? Or is this the time to let business do its thing and invest and spend in the energy area and many others? There's a basis for doing things. We do know how to raise the level of demand. And make no mistake, stimulating growth is the most important thing that the United States can do for poor Americans. It's the most important thing the United States can do for the stock market. It's the most important thing the United States can do for the Canadian economy that depends on us as an export market. It's the most important thing the United States can do for the global economy at a moment when everybody's trying to export more, and we're once again the importer of last resort. And ironically, it's the most important thing we can do for our budget. 1% a year of growth for 10 years is a larger impact on our budget, on our debt to GDP ratio, on the sustainability of our debt, substantially more than everything in the so-called Simpson-Bowles Commission or anything that Congress is debating when it talks about fiscal reform. So that's the second imperative. Will it happen before? But what happened in this season during the lame duck before January 1st? I hope so, but I'm not confident. The third imperative is one the president has been focused on from that first meeting we had with him in December of 2008. And it's something that he feels very strongly in a kind of moral way that goes beyond economic calculation. He inherited huge budget deficits. And he said at that first meeting, I am not going to pass on to my successor the kind of budget deficits that I inherited. Now, in fairness, that was yet another reason why it was damn important that he win the election. Because if he'd lost the election, he would have passed on those kinds of budget deficits to his successor. We're going to confront in the United States the kinds of problems, the kinds of challenge that actually I think are going to be increasingly pervasive in the industrial world. Here's a fact about the United States. We measure our consumer price indices. We set them so that they're all equal to 100 in 1983 for every product. If you look at the consumer price index for television sets, it's 5. Not 100, 5. If you look at the consumer price index for college education or hospital care, it's about 600. So in other words, the relative price of a television set and a day in a hospital room has changed by a factor of 100. 100 over the last 30 years. Now guess what? Government doesn't buy that many television sets. Guess what? Government buys a lot of hospital care. Government doesn't buy that many cell phones. Government pays for a lot of people to go to college. If you think about it, the relative price of the things that the government buys are systematically going way up. And if you think about it, the fraction, who does the government spend money on? Doesn't spend much money on people my age. Doesn't spend that much money on people my kids' age in their mid-20s. Spends a lot of money on people over 65. And the ratio of the number of them to the number of people of working age will have doubled between 2010 and 2035. That's going to mean the government's going to have to be bigger unless it cuts itself back substantially. So we are in ways that the political debate doesn't appreciate, I believe, in the United States and in much of the world, facing upwards pressures on the scale of government. Now that means that anything you don't need to do, you need not to do. And we need to take more seriously cutting back no longer needed areas of government spending than we have traditionally. We're also going to need to think about how to generate substantially more tax revenue. And we're also going to need to think about how to spur growth as a way of generating more revenue. One very important part of that is tax reform. And the real sea change that's happened in American politics, and I give the Bowles-Simpson Commission enormous credit for it, is that Republicans have now recognized that tax expenditures are a kind of expenditure, and that closing loopholes is something they should think of as in a different category. than raising rates. So it will be a test of our system, whether we can come together on revenue-raising tax reform and also on significant cutbacks in our so-called entitlement spending, which Democrats now recognize is more necessary than they ever did before. That will be the focus of next year's politics. That and perhaps immigration reform, where the Republicans, having lost the Latino vote overwhelmingly, will feel enormous pressure to get well by agreeing to a bill. So then if there's a bill, like we have a new immigration policy and Democrats and Republicans agreed on it, nobody can make a political issue out of it. So the pressure on them is enormous to take that away. That'll be the focus of next year. Beyond that, the focus of the remainder of the president's presidency, ironically, will be what he talked about when he began running for president. When he began running for president, he didn't know there was going to be a financial crisis. He didn't know there was going to be a recession. That wasn't what he was talking about at all. And he said to us, he would say to us often, and it was in some ways the most consequential judgment he made as president. I did not run for president to be the president who just got the car out of the rut and back onto the road. I ran for president to fix it and renew it as well. He ran because he thought the great systems of our economy, education, energy, healthcare, finance, weren't working like they were supposed to. And that because they weren't working, people were getting sicker than they should, and much too much was going to many too few people. And that broad agenda, implementing healthcare, and it's a huge thing that we now have universal healthcare in our country. It is probably the most important piece of domestic legislation that's been passed in 50 years in our country. Implementing it will be at the top of his agenda once we get through the budget stuff. I think he's very determined on energy. Now, look, I know that saying he's very determined on energy to a Canadian audience that can't really imagine or conceive why the United States would want to have you export your oil to China rather than the United States by blocking the Keystone Pipeline has real credibility and plausibility problems. Really, I get it. And I actually kind of think personally, like I can't really quite understand why we're not doing the Keystone Pipeline. But here is something to think about, and at least this isn't going to persuade you that we're doing the right thing, and I don't want to argue that we're doing the right thing. I don't even want to predict that we'll keep doing what we're doing. But maybe this is worth your keeping in mind. You know, the president took a more permissive position than any Democratic president ever has on deep sea drilling. And 6 months later, he got BP in the Gulf. And then he took a more permissive position than any Democratic president since Harry Truman had taken on nuclear power. And 5 months after he did that, he got Fukushima. And so a bunch of people telling him they don't really need to worry because engineering studies say stuff and Democratic dogma's wrong. you can see why there might be a certain urge to slow things down and think about it carefully. That's what I think is going on in that energy area. I think there's a chance, I think it's about a 30% chance, that Hurricane Sandy will be marked as having been a decisive moment. I think there are a lot of people who are just going, this just seemed different than anything that happened before and seems related to these climate trends, and maybe we don't want to be the generation that doesn't do anything. So I suspect, not immediately, but if the economy does okay and if the president manages his politics okay and he still has some capital in the bank, I think you may see more action on energy than most people expect. A final thought. I'm an optimist. There aren't that many of them at the moment. If you ask the American people, they tend to say the country's headed a bit in the wrong direction. If you ask people whether their kids' lives are going to be better than theirs, the fraction who say they are going to be better isn't as high as we would like. On the other hand, the history of the United States is a history of self-denying prophecy. John Kennedy died believing that the Soviet Union would outstrip the United States economically by 1985. Every issue of the Harvard Business Review in 1991 had a version of the joke, the Cold War is over, and Japan and Germany won. And so I think that the great strength of the United States is that there is a kind of resilience in the capacity to become alarmed and to mobilize for economic improvement. And it is precisely that sense of alarm that gives me a sense that the future is going to surprise on the upside. Thank you very much.